the most important ways. We have three panelists, Jenny Kendler and Meredith Leich and Lora Lode. I'm going to not read their extensive bios. They're wonderful folks, as you'll find out by listening to them, but maybe ask each one of them to give just a couple of minute or more, 3 or 4 minute intro. How did you get where you are? Lots of young fellows in the audience, and they'll be interested in your pathway because they have to make their own minds up very quickly about what they're going to do next. And then please launch right into your presentations or what you'd like to present. So we'll go first. Let's see, Thomas, who's first? Jenny? I think yes. Jenny, you're first. Yeah. So Jenny, it's all yours.
Thank you, George. Thanks for making this possible. I do really think that this is a really interesting and important topic, especially in the contemporary moment where we can see that the climate crisis is in the news, on the headlines, literally every single day. So thanks for making some space for this. My work is primarily as an interdisciplinary visual artist. So I'm making work in everything from galleries and museums to public spaces or unconventional locations, which you'll see from my work is oftentimes what I like to focus on. A little bit about my background. I have a master's degree from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. That's what brought me here to this fine city. I have a lot of different group affiliations. I am the first artist in residence with the Natural Resources Defense Council, which is a large NGO that works around environmental issues. I also sit on the board of the fundraising board for the global climate change organization 350.org. So I'm sort of spanning these different worlds between environmental activism and visual art. In terms of how I got where I am, I think that, that was sort of the essential question for me, honestly, is how to do both of these things that I was really interested in at the same time. I was lucky enough to be raised in a household where environmental issues were at the forefront and honestly just were normative. I grew up in a passive solar home that my mother, who was a physician, sort of co-designed with architects. We composted. When I would come home from school, it was my job to open and close the solarium to regulate the heat in the household. And when I was a little kid, growing up in suburban Virginia, I didn't know that that wasn't the way that everybody did things. And then of course, as I became older, I also was one of those kids that always wanted to be an artist from the minute that I knew what that word was. I used to spend, hours and hours drawing tiny little intricate scenes with birds and animals and toadstools and frogs and things. And so I think my path was sort of trying to find a way to successfully integrate these two worlds that at one time, I will tell you, seemed very disparate to me. I really struggled in college. I went to college also for fine arts, but I did not really see a vision for how to bring these two things together because it wasn't something that I saw modeled in the world at large. And I'm really grateful to say that that seems to have completely changed, thank goodness, because we are, in the middle of the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, as I said, and we need all the tools in the toolbox, which include people working creatively and in visual arts and in culture change. And I do believe very passionately that this is equally important to doing the political work because we have to create the foundation upon which the public groundswell to make new laws and to make change in our very, very broken economic system can be based upon. So I guess I'll speak about my work for a little while, and then I'm really excited to engage in some Q&A with everyone afterwards, and also honored to be on the panel with these other wonderful makers. So give me 1 second to set up the screen share. Okay, here we go.
Yeah, we can see it. Good.
Great, wonderful. Thank you. I apologize, it takes a little while. But I guess it's, magic, so we should be grateful that it works at all. So I wanted to start with the work of mine that actually is here in Chicago right now. What you're looking at, this piece is called Birds Watching. It is a 40-foot sculpture that, let's see, oh, why am I, oh, there we go. It's a 40-foot sculpture that is made from reflective aluminum. It shows 100 eyes of birds who are either threatened or endangered by climate change. And this piece is here right now in Chicago. It's up on the 606. And so it's somewhere in between Kimball and St. Louis, if anyone wants to go and look at it. This is where the work was originally commissioned for. It's at Storm King, which is a really fabulous sculpture park in the Hudson Valley, north of New York City. And I think I want to start here talking about how do we visualize environmental issues, because of course this piece is literally about vision and envisioning. And in this case, I was really thinking about this gaze, right? How do we look at nature? But in this case, more importantly, reversing that dynamic and asking, how might nature actually look back? Because it seems very important to me that when we think about vision, we think about it not just as this passive sense or a consumption-based sense, which I think is like how we've been trained to think about visuality through extractive capitalism. But in fact, actually, I think of it more as this like reciprocal two-way experience, that there is like looking, there's also being looked upon, and that creates this mutuality. And so in this case, this is about thinking about these birds who literally may be driven from existence by our own actions, and what kind of feelings we as the viewer might encounter thinking about having their gaze turned back upon us. And then the other reason I wanted to start with this piece is because it sort of bookends one end of my practice. This is like much more easy to read as a traditional sculpture, or something that we might more readily encounter as an artwork. It's in a public space, it's three-dimensional, it's made out of metal, that's sort of what we think of as art. But when we think about how we visualize environmental issues, there's actually quite a lot of depth and dimension to how we can do that. So the other end of the spectrum of my work is actually doing direct action and working with activist groups, doing community organizing, communication work around that. I made this banner with my friend who's an amazing artist, a member also of the art collective I'm a part of called Deep Time Chicago, whose name is Ryan Griffiths. And this was part of my work with Extinction Rebellion during the year mostly 2018 and 2019. And part of what we were doing was trying to think about, again, how do we get people to actually literally envision environmental issues? This was a project that we did in Daly Square. We were petitioning the city government to declare a climate emergency, which in fact they actually did. Although now, of course, our job is to actually hold them responsible to give that some teeth and make that a meaningful declaration. So we have here a boat that's kind of become the symbol of these rising tides. And we were asking people, a lot of people, including children, to sort of respond to this prompt that some of you may recognize, this Stolen Dreams from Greta Thunberg's speech to the UN. I might get choked up reading these because some of the children wrote were so heartbreaking, saying things like they were afraid to have children, or in this case, I will never get to see the coral reefs. So it's a way to make tangible some of the things that many of us are feeling, this real climate anxiety or climate grief, and to be able to be active. So visuality can be very important in that respect. And this I just wanted to share also as something a little hopeful in terms of showing that visual culture, being out in the streets, it works. This was a project where we brought hundreds of people to the front of BlackRock, which is one of the world's largest investment firms, is tremendously invested in extraction in the Amazon. And you can see here some of our buddies getting taken out by police. But then in the following months, and I will not say this is due to our action solely because this was a national and international campaign, but BlackRock has actually made some pretty meaningful commitments to try to divest their portfolio from some of the worst things that they're invested in. Again, not anywhere near enough, and we need to hold them to task. This I had to include because looking back on it in my files, I'm struck by, this is the front page of our city's newspaper, right? And what do we have right on the front page is the very beginning of the pandemic. And then underneath, this was folks from Extinction Rebellion and other local environmental groups, again, pressuring the city government, in this case, working against the DAPL pipeline. And so here I'm going to move on to another project that has to do with pipelines and working against fossil fuel extraction And this is another piece that sort of sits at that intersection of art and activism. You see here a tree sitter. She's really brave, amazing person who is part of the struggle to block the Mountain Valley Pipeline, or MVP pipeline. This is the same project. It's called Water Flags, or 1,000 Flags, 1,000 Waters. And it's a collaboration with a frontline activist and poet named Mara Eve Robbins, and also many, many, many other community activists. So these flags that you see hanging here were both literally used to, they were used in DEQ protests. They were literally used to hold a blockade line against bulldozers in the forest where the Mountain Valley Pipeline is supposed to be built. It's actually, these flags are representing every single named water body that will be crossed by the, presumptively crossed and potentially polluted by the pipeline. And we have flags here for both the Mountain Valley Pipeline and the ACP pipeline. The ACP pipeline, again, the slight bit of hope was canceled during the pandemic. So these tactics of wearing companies down really do work. And that's one reason why this type of resistance is really important. This is another project that has been in several different locations, both at the College of DuPage in Chicago and out at Storm King. It was a project to index an entire library of books on climate change from the sort of very earliest, most important works through obscure scientific journals all the way up until the Common Era, and to really think about these kind of clarion calls that scientists, authors, cultural activists have been making for decades at this point that have not been heeded. And so these works, what I did was biochar them, which is by a special process of low oxygen burning that turns them to this highly stable form of carbon. And then they were returned to the earth as tiny bricks of carbon sequestration. So both a kind of honoring of these words, a burial, thinking about how to create use value again in these books that have been kind of overlooked, and also an honoring of the effort of these people who have worked so hard to try to bring light to this issue. This is a project that's currently, it was at the MCA and is currently at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History, which is a tongue twister for Zoom. And I'm very pleased to say it's finally open for 18 months. This was sitting in the dark in the Smithsonian while the pandemic closed the museum. And this is a piece that combines, I guess, the visual and the auditory. So I think it's, when we say, how do we visualize environmental issues? It's like, in some ways, what we're really interested in is how to experience them in a sense-based way. And we should not forget that human beings are not just visual, but that auditory or haptic or smell-based things are also really important ways to reach people and touch their emotions. So in this case, this project is an ivory, it's an ivory keyboard on a 1921 vintage player piano. And it plays a score that takes data of elephant poaching and turns it into musical notation. And so what you hear as the listener is the amount of elephants that may presumptively die in any month in the future because of ivory poaching, played on this very material that's driving the poaching crisis. And the score plays for 10 minutes, which is sort of the equivalent of the next 25 years, and then falls silent at this moment where the algorithm says potentially elephants might become extinct. And so this is an attempt to really bring people into emotionality around these issues and think about how would you actually feel opening the newspaper 25 years from now and reading that the last African elephant had died. And then this will be the last project I talk about quite quickly, which is called the Amber Archive. It is a piece that, it's a project that just came down at an exhibition that I was doing at the MSU Broad Museum as a solo exhibition. And what it is I think a very long-term effort to try to show some small glimpse of the biodiversity crisis. So again, thinking about, how do we tangle with these issues like climate change, like biodiversity loss, when they're diffuse, they're dispersed, they're hard to conceptualize. Like, how can we even conceptualize 1 million potential extinctions? We read about that, but how do we encounter it in a tangible way? Some of these issues like climate change are literally invisible. So in this case, what I'm doing is collecting specimens, all ethically, from all different sorts of species who might be endangered by human activity. And then thinking about this very analog way to preserve this genetic material for some far future, where it may be feasible, ethical to engage in de-extinction by preserving them in artist-created amber. And so there's 300 plus works in this project now, and I imagine that it will continue for many, many years. It's really an attempt to try to begin to show the scale of this crisis in a tangible, visible way. And I'm going to stop screen sharing. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you all listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
I was actually muted. Sorry for that. Thank you, Jenny. That was wonderful. I think we'll defer questions until we've heard all the panelists, and we'll have a free-for-all then. Let's see, Meredith, would you like to go next?
Sure thing. Well, for starters, hello to you all. Thank you to Thomas and George for having us. And Jenny, it's amazing to hear about your work. And I look forward to hearing about yours too, Laura. So I will share my screen. I'll give you a little bit of context about me, and then I'll jump in. But I just thought I'd put this image up because it sort of relates to how I got here. I grew up outside of Boston, which is actually where I am yet again, displaced by the pandemic. And as I was listening to Jenny speak, thinking about this kind of early life context, I also, I think as a kid, had that drawing bug, and just, it was clearly like my primary way of working with the world was just seeing it and reflecting it back through drawing. And I think if I lived in another time, maybe I would just be like a portrait artist and call it a day. But I think if you're sort of closely observing the world visually all the time, and you see that things aren't going so well, it's harder to just to sit there with that. And I grew up in an interreligious family, and so I think in a way I sort of had in the background a kind of like New England environment was somehow part of my understanding of the world. And that meant these old forests and the ocean, and the evidence of the ice sheets that shaped this region are just sort of everywhere. And so I painted this painting that you see here this past winter when I came back here. One of the things that's just sort of a part of the world around us here is these little kettle ponds, Kettle, that were left behind by glaciers. And then in the winter, these small ponds are a great size to freeze, and then people go ice skating. And it's very much part of the kind of like local hockey playing culture. And as I came back this year, many years later, I was thinking about both, as you'll see, the work that I've done, which has a lot to do with glaciers, and also that this sort of winter pastime probably will become less reliable in the coming years. So that's kind of a long-winded way of saying I'm a representational painter. I do watercolors, and I also create animations of various kinds. And I came to Chicago for my MFA, also at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And then I went on to adjunct at SAIC and Loyola. And I have been lucky so far to remotely keep those relationships alive. So I'm going to talk today about two projects. Oh, I should just quickly set a timer here so I don't talk too long. I'm going to talk about two projects that both relate to ice. And so the kind of prelude to that, right before I came to Chicago, I was living in San Francisco. And I think I was missing that New England winter. And I just sort of started having this vision of like, what if it were to snow in San Francisco? And as you guys probably know, the great threat to San Francisco and California and the West Coast is fires. So it was almost like the reverse fantasy where instead of there being clouds of ash and smoke in the air, instead it would snow, which it had this kind of like like storybook quality, but also sort of like, it's almost like turning a nightmare inside out. So I started painting the snow on the city. And it was sort of this way of both observing and creating a fantasy at the same time. And then when I moved to Chicago, there was snow again and plenty of cold. And that made me start to think, as I was sort of in my graduate education and trying to get a handle on how can I mix my interest in art and my long-term concern about climate change. You know, how can I really bring these things together instead of like just being afraid and then painting what I see? And so I just started to think about, what if there were a glacier on Chicago, or how big is a glacier in relation to Chicago? How big is a glacier anyway? And there exists between the School of the Arts of Chicago and University of Chicago, there's these graduate collaborative grant opportunities, and they give grants to artists and scientists working together. So I found a young glaciologist, PhD student, who was willing to work with me, and we got the grant. And so I started to work with his research to build a project about Chicago and a glacier called Quelccaya. So you can see here in the lower left-hand corner, I've actually superimposed the ice cap of Quelccaya on top of Chicago. You can see it's pretty substantial. And this glacier that he was studying, Quelccaya, it's the world's largest tropical ice cap. You may not know there are glaciers in tropical regions, but high in the Andes Mountains is this very substantial ice cap with glaciers kind of running down off of it. And I learned from my collaborator, Andrew, that the way that scientists were observing the changes was actually from outer space. So as these satellites rotated around the Earth, they were taking pictures, and you can see over time how the glacier is shrinking. And I thought that was sort of incredible, especially as someone who is an animator, that there are these kind of like stop motion animation records of the changing ice, and then also records of the changing Chicago. And so you can kind of be this little blip in the Northern Hemisphere watching something in the Southern Hemisphere change. And at the time I was working with a lot of 3D animation technology in addition to doing watercolors. And so I learned that one of the ways that glaciologists look at glaciers is also through these radar maps of the glaciers. You actually are seeing a height map, so where it's high, where it's low. And I could bring that back into a computer and sort of recreate a 3D version of the topography of the glacier. And then I could start to play with a virtual Chicago and a virtual glacier in the same space. So here's Chicago hovering over the Quelccaya ice cap. And those same satellite images let glaciologists see how much it's shrinking from year to year. And so we started sort of playing around, like, what if the amount of ice that has melted since the Landsat, which is the satellite that's recording Quelccaya, what if that amount of ice were to fall on Chicago as snow? And we figured out that it would be, I believe, about 600 feet. So it would basically obscure the whole of Chicago. And so I, through lots of conversations with Andrew and sort of pulling out this imagery even further, we turned it into a short film that kind of explores relationships between satellite imagery, climate change, looking at these things from far away, trying to understand it all. And I'll just show you a little 1-minute sample. So that's just a little excerpt. Oh, come. How do I get out of this? There we go. So that's an excerpt from the film. You can see the whole thing on my website if you would like. And I'll just touch on the follow-up project to that, because it's like you do one thing and then it immediately rolls into something else and you doubt everything that you just did and you need to start in on something. I don't know, that's how it is for me, at least. So I worked on the Scaling Kalkaya project for several years, really, from first conversations into turning it into a short film. And then I felt a need to sort of turn all of it on its head, because though I felt like I was able to kind of grasp how big this glacier was from a distance and learn about how the science worked, I then had the chance to actually go to a glacier in the flesh and the ice for the first time. And that spawned a whole new project, which has taken another several years and will actually be showing in Chicago this fall at the Sullivan Galleries at SISE, opening at the end of August, if all goes well. So yes, so after working, looking at these glaciers from outer space, I had the chance to go to a residency in the wilderness of Alaska at the edge of a national park. And seeing real glaciers was like a whole new addition to my understanding of the world, because they are full of water and motion and force and noise. And I felt like my more sort of distant computer way of working didn't match up at all with this very visceral, powerful way of seeing the actual ice and water. So I did the same, and I painted a bunch, my sort of first way of dealing with things. And you can see a little elephant had made its way on here at some point, just trying to grasp like what is a glacier, how does it form our world, and how on earth how can we be letting them melt? And so I started brewing this project, and this connects back to what I was saying about how I'm from the Boston area in Massachusetts and this glacial landscape. And I was realizing that these glaciers that I can see in Alaska once sat on all of New England, all of the Chicago area, all of the top of North America, essentially. And the world that we live in now is completely shaped by them. And if they change, that will change the world that we live in now in just as radical a sense. So I almost felt like I needed to kind of come back and give the story of the glacier back to itself somehow, to acknowledge its force, its power. So I started making these stop motion drawings where I would draw a little bit of a mark and take a picture, draw a little bit of a mark and take a picture. So sort of like doing what the satellite was doing for the glaciologists, but just doing it with my hand now. And these were drawings that I made in response to walking out onto the glacier and learning about how they grow and form over time. And then I hiked out. This is the abandoned town that I was staying at in Alaska, with a group of people onto the glacier, brave souls who came with me, and projected animations onto the ice. And then I, several years later, this summer in fact, managed to go out to the tip of, here I'll show you again, the tip of the old moraine, which is the end of the glacier in the island of Cuttyhunk right here. This is Cape Cod, if anyone's familiar with the tip of Massachusetts, and project these two sets of animations. So here's my little pairing of the glacier and the rocks that it carried down to the edge of the water. So that is, I'm still in the process of editing it and figuring it out, but that will be on view this fall at the Sullivan Galleries in Chicago. And then another project unrelated to glaciers, but just my last thing that I'll say is that I'm also part of a show that's happening this summer out in the Brushwood Center at Ryerson Woods in River Woods. And it's called Third Coast: Disrupted Artisan Science and Climate. And it's all about climate in the Chicago area in particular, and what kind of changes are happening here. So this is if Michigan Ave in downtown Chicago were to become like Venice. And this is actually a picture of a real thing that happened, which was a flooded McDonald's in Des Plaines, Illinois a few years ago. So thank you so much for listening. And I look forward to talking to you guys at the end.
Fantastic. Thank you, Meredith. Really wonderful to see the way you're picturing these things, making us think in ways that we have never thought before. Really fantastic. Lora, would you like to step up to the, I guess, the microphone, if we want to call it that?
Yes. Hello. Hi. So my name is Lora Lode, and a little bit of background, was at UIC for undergrad, and I did my master's, my MFA at UIUC in Champaign-Urbana. Not trying to attend all of the University of Illinois schools. It just happened to be, that was the way it worked. So in terms of pathway, I think that's an interesting question. And very similar, Jenny, I feel like I really appreciate, first of all, appreciate being the invite. Really appreciated seeing both of your work. Jenny, I was pretty familiar with some of your work, and Meredith, not so familiar with your work, but it was amazing and really wonderful to see. I could imagine having some really interesting conversations with both of you. But similar to Jenny, I feel like I grew up with a farmer father. At some point in time, he wasn't a farmer, but I grew up in a suburb in which he turned our backyard into about a half-an-acre farm. He really converted a suburban lawn into a farm. So I grew up with a father like that I kind of followed around, was very influenced by, and then also not so much art with a capital A, but I had a mom who was super crafty. So I grew up with these two kinds of things, like crafts and like a really, really, really strong awareness of where our food came from. We pretty much generated almost all of our produce from our garden, did a lot of canning and pickling and things like that. So was kind of exposed to that all my life. You know, then whatever, 20 some years later, decide to go to school for art. And in grad school was where I really struggled with, like, you know, wanting to make work that had some relevance, to the issues of the day. So whether that was political, whether that was social, whether it was environmental, sort of all of those things were things that I was trying to figure out a way to, how can I make art work with that? And in some ways, I feel like that's still not so much a struggle, but it's still a question I always think about is, you know, how does art function to help visualize some of these things, or turn some of these things on their head, or sort of, you know, recontextualize things so that we can ask questions and think about what is going on in the world through this lens of art, using art for a significant, like, social or political purpose. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and just start with an image. From my slideshow. That's gonna take a second to start here. So I had said I put it on timings, but I actually didn't. So I'm just gonna keep track of the time. Does anybody by any chance recognize what this flower is? Just out of curiosity.
I can't see it.
You can't see it?
No.
Okay, let me make sure I'm screen sharing. Okay, what's going on here? Sorry, just one sec. Well, I'll keep talking. Let me see. I think I didn't click on share. There we go.
There you go. Perfect.
Okay, sorry about that. Sometimes that happens. Okay. So here we go.
Yeah, we got it.
Okay, so you can see that, right? Anybody know this plant by any chance, or this flower? So, so going back to just the trajectory. So, eventually I land into art, but I'm also still really highly involved in different kinds of activities. I manage a community garden that's next door to my house. And this is something that I look out my kitchen window and see at a certain time during the spring. It is the flower that belongs to a pawpaw tree. So we have a pawpaw tree in this community garden that's fully mature. And I don't know if anyone knows what pawpaw fruit is, but it's kind of amazing. It's actually really sort of native to this area and a little bit south of this area. And so the fruit is kind of like a cross between mango and banana. But I just wanted to start with this because I live so close to this area next to me, and I work so closely with people around environmental, particularly growing, regenerative sort of growing practices, that it's just sort of forced its way into my life and also forced its way into my work. So I'm going to start with this overview slide. I teach at SISE. I manage a community garden that's next door to my house. I work with a national organization that's called the Bionutrient Food Association. And the Bionutrient Food Association works to on outreach, educational stuff, all regarding proposing regenerative farm practices for growing, anywhere from small scale to very, very, very large scale farms. So I attend the Soil and Nutrition Conference every year, and I've sort of just really just sunk into learning so much more about regenerative ways of treating the soil to grow more nutrient-dense food, and also to develop more organisms in the soil, which all ends up also adding to the ability for soil to capture carbon. And I'm going to talk about that in my first project. And then I also have done some curatorial work and also some collaborative work. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that because both of those many projects were also related to either working around ideas of, environmental issues or current social political issues, which are, they're intertwined often. So a current project that I've been working on is trying to visualize what's happening. So I sort of took my artist self into a sort of like science-y mind to try to visualize for myself and understand what is happening if we're trying to build up soil organic matter in order to draw down carbon into the soil. There are some estimates, some scientists estimate that if we converted industrial farming practices over to regenerative farming practices, that we could draw down 50 parts per million of carbon over the next 5 years. So to me, it seemed like something that's really crucial, and also doable, maybe. I mean, aside from all of the obstacles, political sort of obstacles that we have in government and large corporations that might make it difficult for farmers to switch over to regenerative practices. I'm actually sort of hopeful after having met many, many, many farmers that have gone from, and these are large scale farmers, hundreds of acres, who are slowly, not all at once, but converting their practices to regenerative practices. And so I thought, well, I wonder how I could do something about this and sort of make it a display, something that you could walk down the street and walk by. So I was thinking about the idea of just making demonstration gardens and then creating signage that would sort of synthesize and also sort of distill down the information around what is actually happening through the photosynthetic process, putting carbon in the soil, what's going on with the root exudates, and what's going on with the rhizosphere, and how does this all work to keep carbon in the soil. And so a lot of that then led me to just really kind of looking at plant life. I'm looking at soil life, like microorganisms. And in my studio, this is just a snapshot of studio wall kind of playing, is a just thinking process and wrapping my head around all of these things. And some of this makes its way into a final project and some of it doesn't. But I thought it might be fun to show just like studio process, because a lot of that is really, it really is just playful and like studying doing observational drawings of microorganisms, trees. I'm really inspired by field guides. I just really love little field guides, and I also really love scientific illustration. And so I'm looking at those sorts of things and sort of taking them apart and just playing around with them. And then this is the next slide, just another version of that sign that just lives in my kitchen, so I can look at it and kind of think about whether or not it needs to change and take things out and put things back in. So this is a current project that I'm still working on, and I've only done one demonstration garden so far, but I'm hoping to do about 5 more over the next few years. So if anyone would like to host a demonstration garden, I'd be happy to plant it. Most of the demonstration gardens contain things like grasses with really long roots, because those are very helpful for keeping carbon in the soil, as well as cover cropping, which help to feed the microorganisms in the soil and then also can become compost for the next year. And then another project I've been working on is called Field Notations. And I've been really always like really fascinated by those little field notes journals. I don't know if anybody else has those, but I always thought they're really cute. They do such a good job at branding. So I was kind of riffing off of those and then creating my own version of a little like zine booklet type thing, in which I was inviting participation from many different neighborhood sites and gardens to create their own stories. I also feel that the social side of these, like, community gardens are great for growing food and growing organic food and having food access to many neighborhoods that don't have access to healthy food. It's a wonderful thing. But there's also the social side of community garden spaces that I find really, really, really fascinating. It can really be a healthy thing. It can also sometimes be an unhealthy thing, but in many cases, it's actually a safe space for a lot of kids to hang out in, and for people to hang out and get to know each other. So I kind of wanted to focus on the social side of those things a bit, and was inviting the neighbors that live near these green spaces to sort of create their own stories and their own like booklet of what happens in those spaces. So giving them ownership and maybe just providing a few prompts or providing materials. And so in the first instance, what I did was I invited neighbors that were near the community garden that I work in and their kids. I gave everyone an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper and a micro pen, and asked people, and this was in the winter, and just asked people to make a map of the garden based on their memory. And so they just became a part of the zine, was this series of maps. I think there were about 15 of them, and they're all really interestingly very, very, very different. And then they were displayed in an exhibition at a space called Adsdana. The exhibition was called Being There. It's on the far wall. It's a little difficult to see because the wall is white and the drawings are white. So all the memory map drawings were presented there. And then next to that, I had, this was maybe a little bit of a sort of humorous take on wanting to know what's going on in a compost pile in the winter. So I did live streaming via Periscope of what was going on inside the compost pile for the duration of the exhibition. And then, so the beginning of this presentation, there's some solo projects that I've worked on, but I'm going to pretty quickly shift over to a lot of projects that I've collaborated with people on, or programming, done programming in experimental cultural spaces. So this project I did a long time ago. I actually started it in about 2003. It's called Stormy Weather. And it was kind of before, at least for me, the realization that climate crisis was causing so many more storms and fires and things like that. So this is sort of an interesting accident in a way that I chose hurricanes. What I was looking at that time and what I was fascinated by was the way we gave them these very pedestrian names, like Bob or I don't know, Carol. I just thought something like a hurricane, that's really interesting, that this gigantic thing that could destroy so much in such a short amount of time was so uncontrollable. would be given these very pedestrian names. So I went to the National Oceanic website and I started looking up the satellite imagery for the hurricanes. And I did tracings of the hurricane, and then it created a pattern for that. And then I created these cute little pillows. So the idea was like taking something that's like really big and scary and making this sort of sweet little pillow that you could hold. And then each hurricane with its actual name and actual shape were brought together with these little tags that were hand embroidered with the names of the hurricanes. And that I plan to continue actually working on that. So it ended, the last version was in 2007, and I haven't actually updated, but I'm going to go back and actually add more to those. And then this is the beginning of like collaborating, my collaborative work and facilitating as well. So the little flyer here that you see that says recycle your household paint. I worked with a group called People Powered, and we designed a program for a recycling paint program. And we solicited, using that flyer, empty cans of paint. Unused cans of paint. So all around from the city of Chicago, people would call us and ask us if they could drop off their paint. We would take the paint, we would combine all the blues together, all the reds together, all the yellows together, and so on, and then create and clean it and strain it and put it back into a new can and sort of rebrand it. So it looked nice enough to take. And on the palette, where all the blues are painted on the palette, those are all the different kinds of blues that we collected. And then it's mixed into a new blue, a people-powered blue. And we created these labels that you see at the bottom. And the labels were actually distributed for free through our website because we were actually interested in this as like a sharing project, as an open source project for anyone to do. So it then went on to happen in several cities. And then after it would happen in this, whatever city it was, usually it was started by an art gallery, and then they would display the cans of paint. But it was a way to divert this paint that would otherwise go into the waste stream and sort of create a new version of paint. And then I realize I'm going over a little bit. So I'm going to go quickly through this project, and I might skip a couple of things here. So The Sky is Falling, the Money's All Gone was a really phenomenal experiment by a performance group called Lucky Pierre. They proposed a 10-week period of participants, artists, writers, musicians, people from all walks of life to come together, and we did readings, and we responded to prompts that were given by the group that was facilitating, and developed creative responses to themes of environmental and economic fragility. And the banner was something that I made for the exhibition. And then the group that I worked with in our offshoot groups, we looked at what was happening in Pilsen around the coal plants and did some research to collect data on the toxins that were being found in the soils that were around those plants. So lead, arsenic, cadmium, things like that. We created posters that displayed that data. And then we also did some mud stenciling out on the streets and also used sidewalk chalk to put some of that data out onto the streets so that anyone walking by could also see what was going on in their neighborhood. Even though it was always present, it's not visible all the time, right? So we were trying to make these things visible. And then at the end of the exhibition, we just displayed some of these posters and had another mud stenciling workshop. And then the next few things are spaces that I've programmed at. So Mess Hall was a space in Rogers Park that was a space based on really experimental cultural production. Most projects, I would say, were very often related to something that was happening socially or politically in the moment. This was a visualization of the economic crisis starting like 2007, 2008. So there's a timeline that invited the audience to also take part and share their stories about their experience of that economic crisis. And then that was participatory budgeting proposals that we also hosted at that space. And then the Library of Radiant Optimism was a poster show that artists were invited to make posters about either their own work, usually artists that were doing something, proposing perhaps a solution or a better way forward. That's why it was hence called Library of Radiant Optimism. That was later then made into a book that was called Let's Remake the World. And then Compound Yellow is a space that I have worked at up until about 2020 from 2016. Again, another experimental cultural center. This is in Oak Park, Illinois. This is the Self-Reliance Library that was installed by the group Temporary Services that I was once a member of. This is a phenomenal library that they installed that has all kinds of books that are related to sort of utopic notions. A lot of them are about like ecologically sound living, foraging, blueprints for fantasy worlds and alternate realities, how to make your own like Adobe house, you know, really a sort of radical library in which they had workshops and talks and film screenings during the course of their 3-month residency. They also hosted a bookstore next door where they sold some of their publications. And one of the other projects, we did probably 100 projects at Compound Yellow. I'm only showing 2 projects that we hosted. This was a solar furnace capable of making 1 cup of coffee, in which we hosted an event that was just a coffee making and coffee drinking day to use this solar furnace that was created by Eric Newman. And then finally, this is the last thing, is community engagement. I was a facilitator for ArchiWorks postgraduate design certificate. And ArchiWorks is a Chicago-based multidisciplinary design educator, advancing design in the public interest, trying to shape healthy, sustainable, equitable communities. We partnered with NeighborSpace, who is a land trust organization that buys empty lots and turns them into, they buy them from the city and turn them into community gardens. They have about 150 community gardens. And we worked with NeighborSpace to try to figure out what they needed, what would help them. What they were interested in is more visibility. And so our team was responsible for creating proposals to help grow NeighborSpace's visibility, their outreach, a tool lending library. We built a tool bike cart for them. And we created some propositions for a new website design, signage, and logo. In the end, we ended with an exhibition and a public event and public critique, where the design team put together all of our research and all of our findings and all of our proposals up on the wall in the background there. And then it ends with this bike cart.
Yeah, dealing with people being upset that the kids are throwing tomatoes and pulling up onions when they have nothing to do in the neighborhood, and it makes total sense to me.
So that bike cart was designed to be a tool lending library that traveled throughout the city. And the audio that you heard was actually just a clip from several gardens interviews with gardens across the city that is actually still up and hosted on SoundCloud under NeighborSpace. Yeah, so that's it. So thank you.
Wonderful, Lora. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone. I think we've all had our eyes opened. We have time for a few questions. I'm going to ask, because Adele just posted this a minute ago in the chat. Adele, would you ask your question?
Sure. Thank you all so much for the presentation. I really enjoyed seeing all the different forms of art. My question was related to your motivations behind your creations and kind of just what motivates you to create art. And I've heard different perspectives where people will say like, oh, create art, make stuff that you want to create and don't really worry about making it for someone else. And I was just curious how that factored into your art making.
Mm-hmm. I can jump in for a second on this one. I think that's a great question. I mean, I think it's makes me think of sort of expansively, like, why do we do anything in our lifetimes, right? It's like, I think like we have this complicated culture where we're sort of told that we should be self-serving and trying to like achieve in a very like sort of specified way. And I think that mentality has really trickled over into the art world as well. But I think a lot of what I'm interested in my work is like really unpacking that and thinking about where motivation like that might come from. Like, why are we told to make things that are self-serving or that please only ourselves? I think that if I really thought that way, I wouldn't do what I do because it's actually really difficult. And I think that the reason that a lot of, I mean, I can't speak for my colleagues, but I mean, I think the reason that we do what we do is because we're really driven to communicate something and share it with other people. And so for me, something that plays a big part in this is this idea of generosity to one's audience, right? I don't know exactly who I'm talking to. I think that my work could be for anyone, but I certainly recognize it's not for everyone. But I want to have as kind of many open doors to engage with the work as possible. And so whether that be like using beauty as part of the strategy, or you know, using community engagement as a strategy to really make it accessible and interesting from many different perspectives, whether it be like theoretically and intellectually or aesthetically and sense-based. So yeah, for me, I think that the work would not be satisfying if it was just for myself. And I think you know, it would be easier, but I'm not sure what the point would be. So
Great answer. Meredith or Lora, you want to comment?
Sure, I can jump in. I would say for me that while of course I make because I like to draw, and there's this kind of deep satisfaction that just, I don't know, like runners like to run kind of thing. But I think that I sit in like a space of emotional communication. Like I think a lot about fear as a somewhat fearful person in general, but specifically fears around climate change, fears of the future. And how can I stay in a space that lets me keep thinking about something that I'm afraid without turning away from it? And so I feel like my work in a way is trying to offer comfort of a kind, like come into this space with me. It'll be all right. And we're going to look at this thing together. And we're gonna try to acknowledge what's happening and stay with it and stay with it and stay with it. Because I think the way the news functions right now, it's almost too much. I mean, it's too much. There's an impulse to just kind of turn away. So I think I try to work with scientific issues and truth and things outside of just my imagination. But I think the kind of communicative aspect is trying to build a kind of space where we can stay with something that's really hard to stay with just in day-to-day life.
Boy, another great answer. Thanks so much. And Lora, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of second what everybody is saying too. I mean, they both, Jenny and Meredith, such great things. But I feel like for me, it is a slow process of realizing that there was something that wasn't satisfying about just making work that was, for me, that wasn't communicating things that seemed they were so urgent to communicate, that it was urgent to be able to communicate something, and then realizing that art is a really useful tool. I mean, not just to put it in a category of a useful tool, because it's a lot of things, and I feel like there's still a lot of satisfaction in sitting down and just drawing. And I think a lot of artists still find satisfaction in whatever it is that they're making in terms of the making process. That's very satisfying. But I just think it was a very slow process of getting to a point where I realized, like, I felt like it was really important to be able to communicate something about important things that were happening all around and not sort of cut off the studio from the rest of the world. It just didn't feel healthy. It didn't feel organic. It just didn't feel right. It felt like, you know, life infiltrates your studio and your studio infiltrates life. Like it's like that. It's a dynamic process.
Yeah, I love the one thing you all mentioned was the connectivity between what you do and the real world, however we perceive that. And what an important concept. And I say one more time that this whole day, and especially this session, has really emphasized that there are many ways to communicate. We scientists often think that it's all intellectual, but of course, a lot of it is emotional, and a lot of it is cultural, and a lot of it is just feeling it. And it's great to hear that the three of you, are feeling it very, very strongly. I think that's so important. I'm looking at the time, and I'm thinking that we ought to adjourn just because we want to respect everyone's time. So I think that's what we'll do. Thank you to all three panelists, Meredith and Jenny and Lora, and thanks to the fellows. I was watching the chat. There's much more in this session. The chat is between individual people in the audience, and a lot of times the panelists are actually participating in the chat. I love that. That's really, really interesting. And I'll tell you, that's different. We didn't have that feature in most of the other sessions, but it's great that we're able to communicate. So I think we're going to adjourn.